Thank you everyone for coming to today's event. Big thank you to Julien for joining us today to talk about some of the unique and interesting experiences that he's had over the course of his career. Julien is actually someone that I've known for a very long time, since I was younger than even the youngest people in this room. Julien and I went to college together at Princeton University. So yeah, I mean, what is this? That's like 23 years ago or something like that. 24, actually, right? We're having our 20th.
Yeah, I think so.
Something like that.
97.
My God, that's 24 years ago. Met him in the dining hall, probably week 1 of college. But Julien was interesting and entertaining back in the college days. But you know, in some sense, has been even more interesting and someone to learn from in unique ways, kind of post college, because he's done some really cool.
I see you admitted in entertaining.
Well, we're getting old. We don't know what that means anymore, right? So
exactly.
yeah, unfortunately. But he's done some really unique, interesting, and honestly, like some things that I think he should be extremely proud of over the course of his career. And so I would love to kind of take the opportunity of this event for you to be able to share some of what you've learned, some of your experiences, and maybe some best practices, generalizable takeaways that we can take from the things you did. So maybe Julien, I'll let you kind of talk a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we can kind of do a bit of back and forth there, and then later on students can ask whatever they want to, I guess. So thank you, Julien.
Sure. Hey, yeah, thank you for having me on, Jero. So my name is Julien Beguin. I met Jero in college. I grew up in New York and in Geneva, Switzerland. And I studied computer science. I originally started off in physics, ended up shifting over to computer science at Princeton. And after that, I worked for about 5 years at Goldman Sachs in their technology department.
Yeah, I don't think you need to talk much. You don't need to talk much about it.
Yeah, I won't talk much about it.
I don't think
it wasn't that exciting, but it was it was a good experience. But anyway, so in terms of startups, I did a few sort of smaller startup-y kind of things that I wouldn't call formal startups, like a little gaming company, so stuff like that. But the bigger one was a company called Touchco, which I co-founded with my good friend Ilya Rosenberg, who we were also in college with Jero and I. And Ilya had essentially, he was doing a PhD, and he had discovered, a brilliant guy, and he discovered a new technology called IFSR.
What does IFSR
stand for? Interpolating, I was about to tell you, interpolating force sensing resistance. And what that is essentially, it was a new touch sensor technology that essentially, so, you know, like now we take it for granted on your iPad or your iPhone or your touchpad that you can put down multiple fingers and it'll track all of those. Back at the time, the vast majority of touch sensors, where they existed, were single touch. So you could only touch in one place. So you couldn't do pinching gestures or double 2-finger swipes or anything like that. And so we actually, I think this is in 2009, Ilya invented this technology, IFSR, which allowed you to do multi-touch interaction to basically touch with, to have a pad that would actually track not just one finger, but it would track as many fingers as you wanted on there. And not only would it track multiple points, it actually could detect how hard each point was pressing, each finger was pressing. So it could tell the difference between a light touch or a heavy touch or a medium touch. And this is a feature that, I mean, eventually came out like on the Apple touchpads and many years later. But we were doing this in 2009, just as like the iPad and the iPhone, just as these things were brand new at the time, and we were doing force sensing already. So basically he came across this technology, and he asked me and a couple other people to join him as co-founders to commercialize this technology. So it was being done at NYU. And one of the things that universities do sometimes when they come across, when someone invents valuable intellectual property, the universities want to essentially profit from this, but they don't want to be directly involved in commercializing and marketing it. So what they do often is the university will take a stake, and then the inventor or someone else at the university will found a company, often with others or with investment, to commercialize the thing. Because there's a big gap between a newly invented technology in a lab at a university and actually having a product. There's a world of difference between those things. So Touchco, we had the technology, but we had to convert this from something that works under the right conditions in a lab to something that you can actually sell to someone. And so to do that, we had to figure out, well, one, how do we build it? And we had to write all the software and everything to support it. And then importantly, we also had to figure out who is going to want to buy this and who wants to use it, because we didn't really have an idea. And there was a lot of exploration, and that was one of the main things we did at Touchco, was actually trying to find potential buyers for this, potential users. So we explored everything from like, touchpads on computers to we actually did a foot sensor. So people who make like custom orthotics. So the thing with our IFSR sensors, it didn't just detect points, it actually captured a whole force image. So it knew at every single point on this pad, it knew how hard you're pressing. So one company, we had an agreement with it. They basically funded us to develop a foot sensor so that they can so someone could step on it and then they could print out a custom orthotic based on the exact pressure points on the feet. So that was something we were exploring. I know early on, actually before even we got to IFSR, Ilya had been exploring using FSR sensors, which is sort of the predecessor to this, the basic component, to detect tennis balls, to detect like, for I think it's called line calling. Is that right? Basically knowing if a tennis ball is close to being out, if it's in or if it's out. So now I think you have some camera systems who did it. Before, obviously, it was judges, referees. So Ilya was exploring, he actually had tennis courts where he had equipped them, fitted them out with FSR sensors underneath.
Julian, it was actually a little bit weird that at some point I'm visiting him and he comes out with like a gun that shoots tennis balls. I was like,
why do you have this?
What are you doing with
dangerous weapon?
But by the way, I'll mention one thing, right? One of the things to note with what Julian is saying right now is that sometimes you start a startup where your initial trigger is a technology. And so you've got a technology that is looking for a problem to solve, right? And with some of these things, even if a company ends up succeeding, if you look at the initial problems that they were trying to solve at round one, sometimes these things are actually rather hilarious, because you're like, how in the world could there have ever been a market for something like this? And the answer is there was never a market for it. It's just, the founder was trying something out and it was just, didn't have good intuition on what would have a market or not. But if you're willing to take feedback from the market and realize, okay, no one wants this, let me try the next thing. You have I could go figure, many shots of the tennis ball gun at it. And you can eventually get to something that actually does have a market, right? And I think Touchco was like one example that illustrates this. So sorry, I just wanted to synthesize.
No, it's fine. I mean, it's really key in startups to be flexible. I mean, you do want to have a goal or something you're targeting to, but things can change so fast. And when you're building a new technology or you're commercializing a technology, you discover things about it and you discover things about the market that you really had no way of knowing before. And you have to be willing and able to pivot if it's necessary, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so back to Touchco or?
Back to Touch. Well, I mean, there's more to Touchco than this, right? So
there is more to Touchco than this. So, okay. So and we set up and we got a little tiny shared office space, which was effectively like in a cage, in a shared workspace. Like it had a giant sliding metal cage door. So we were working like, and we would stuff, like 6 people in this tiny little cage that was sort of designed for 1 or 2. And we worked away, and we had to solve a lot of problems for it. So it was a hardware product, which adds a whole new dimension of complexity over a software product. And we had to figure out, so we used these special FSR, these special carbon inks. That was one of the things we used. We used different inks for printing silver traces, essentially conductors, right? And we had to figure out what exactly was the right silver ink, what was the right carbon ink to use on this, and because they had different properties, some were more responsive, some were less responsive. So we would do many iterations with this, and we would have to have them printed. And then we used a mix of things. So we had someone more local who could do this printing, but it was faster, but it was more expensive. And then we also, for larger batches, we would have them done in Asia and have them shipped. And obviously that was going to be a much bigger turnaround, but we could do larger volumes for much cheaper. And so we had to explore all these manufacturers, including like trips out to China and everything. And we would do prints of, we would ask to like make the same thing printed except with 10 different inks. And then we would have to test all 10 of them to figure out exactly what worked. And then on top of the physical stuff, we also had to figure out like, what are the right algorithms for driving this? So we had to figure, so we were tracking touches, but it doesn't just tell you touches right off the bat. It gives you raw data, essentially a force image, and we had to figure out how do you differentiate between a finger, between a wrist that you want to ignore, between a stylus that maybe you want to treat differently. So we did a lot of work on those algorithms, and then we also did a lot of work on trying to on making demos to show what the technology could do, because it's one thing if you say, oh, I have a new Mousetrap, like, okay, it catches mice, right? But if you're demonstrating a force sensing, touchpad, no one's ever used this before. They've barely used multi-touch, regular sensors before. You really have to show, oh, what can you do with this that you couldn't do with other things? So we did demos where we had games. We did a demo that did like a medical imaging application, and like you can manipulate and then draw on it, things like that. And we did this pressure thing for the foot. So we had to actually create demos for this. And we actually showed this at a graphics conference. We got invited to a graphics conference in New Orleans, and we actually drove 24 hours straight down there. We showed up with like 8 people in matching t-shirts, and like it was quite fun actually demonstrating everything. Anyways, so
by the way, so all this stuff was expensive.
Yeah.
Doing hardware startup, expensive. So, and
yes,
by the way, this is around the
expensive.
Financial crisis, right? I mean, wasn't it around that time?
This is
just before,
just about, just shortly after, sort of in the tail end of it. Yeah,
not an easy time to raise funding.
Yeah, well, we actually didn't raise funding for the first round. We just did loans from the founders. We each did loans to the company initially, and we operated on that. And we just took, I think at one point we had to take a bare minimum salary to get like health insurance, but eventually we I don't think we ended up paying that salary anymore. We ended up spending it on materials for prototyping. So I mean, it did require money, but it also just required a lot of time and labor and innovation and creativity. And it also required a lot of flexibility. You had to be willing to do one thing one day and then turn around and completely do something, so there's no job descriptions in a startup like that, in a little startup. One day I'm writing algorithms, like the next day I'm making t-shirts, the next day I'm doing like benefits administration, so we're cleaning out the office, so you're everything at the same time. Sorry, I
said the cage.
The cage, in the cage, yes, cleaning up the cage, yes, there you go. Mucking the cage, yeah. So yeah, it required a lot of flexibility in what we did. And then I guess towards the end, we ultimately, we did this this presentation down in New Orleans where we demonstrated our technology, and we ended up getting some coverage in the New York Times and in other in like their tech blog, and I think in various online sources, magazines. And I think about 9 months in from the founding of the company, we ended up being acquired. And we were at that point, we were sort of at the point where we basically had to either accept funding and get funding and expand our operation, and try to build a product, but we got this acquisition offer. It was a little bit surprising. And we thought very carefully and decided to pursue the acquisition. This was the first startup for all of us, and it was it was a substantial change. Would be a substantial change for our lives, and that's what we ended up doing.
Yeah, what was the company?
It was never technically public.
Okay, well, then tell us where you worked next.
You could say what you'd like, but it was never technically public.
Okay, interesting. Well,
yes,
I guess I already told them.
So anyways, okay, so long story short, after that, me and my entire team ended up working for Amazon Lab 126 in California. So we ended up there, and we ended up forming the so myself and the co-founders and a couple other people, we ended up forming sort of the core of a team at Amazon Lab 126 in Cupertino, as part of a team that was investigating emerging technologies and investigating new technologies and new products, sort of not things that were coming out immediately, but things that were sort of down the line, and technologies that were down the line.
Maybe you can tell them a little bit about Lab 126, because a lot of people don't know about it, but it's a very interesting organization.
So as most of you know, Amazon is based up in Seattle, but Lab 126 is it's a wholly owned subsidiary of Amazon. It was set up to create the Kindle e-reader, which was Amazon's first consumer electronics product. Before that, they didn't have anything. So the reason they set up Lab 126 down in Cupertino is that in Seattle, they had a lot of software talent, but they didn't really have as much hardware talent as they have down in the Bay Area and in the Stanford area. So they set up this Silicon Valley operation. Originally it was just a few people. And when I joined, I think we're maybe 250 people there. And so I think they'd done 2 versions of the Kindle. They had just made the second version of the Kindle at that time. So they basically just had one product, which was the Kindle. And by the time I left 5 years later, they had something like 12 products and 3,000-4,000 people. So it grew a lot during that period, when Amazon came up with a whole slew of new consumer electronic products, including things that you're familiar with, I'm sure, like Amazon, like Alexa, or Echo rather. Alexa is the voice, Echo is the product, and Fire TV tablets, the Fire TV consoles for television, the Fire phone, which was a disaster, but you hit some, you miss some. And so I was in this group where we were investigating. So I was involved in a lot of sort of early concepting on some of these products and some new products. I would, when someone would want to pitch, a startup would want to pitch new technology to us, I would often be taking those meetings. And it was interesting to be all of a sudden on the other side of that table. All of a sudden, it was very different. And sort of one of the bigger things I did there later on was I invented something called Amazon Dash, which is a home shopping appliance Effectively, it was Amazon's first IoT product at that time. Are people familiar with IoT, or we should probably describe it? So IoT is Internet of Things. Basically, what it means is the idea of the Internet of Things is that instead of having just a big computer that's attached to the internet and then dumb everything else, appliances, the idea with IoT is that everything is connected to the internet. It's an Internet of Things, like Internet of your dishwasher and like your hair dryer and your watch and everything. So basically, the concept of having smaller appliances and smaller devices all being connected to the internet and interacting with each other is what is meant by IoT. And the thing that enabled IoT was very small and inexpensive Wi-Fi and Bluetooth chips. So before they used to be expensive and power hungry, any kind of wireless solution. And with the advent of cell phones and smartphones, the prices on all of those things on Bluetooth and Wi-Fi got driven down incredibly, and maybe more importantly, the power consumption of those kinds of chips got driven down incredibly. And what that enabled is this IoT, is that now your hair dryer can be a smart hair dryer for whatever reason that is. But more importantly, things like watches. And specifically also things like the Nest door cam, that's like an example of IoT, I'd say. But what I came across in terms of application, what I was doing is, so our group, we were focused, Lab 126 was really focused more on like readers, on like e-readers, and they both the tablets and the Kindles kinds of e-ink things. And on they did a phone, they were working, I think Alexa, Echo was not out yet at the time. But we were very focused on like digital content consumption. But I thought about it, I was like, well, really, that's not the core of Amazon's business. There's this whole, like the primary business of Amazon is shipping and selling and shipping things, right? And so I was looking at IoT and I was thinking, well, what kinds of new applications can we find for this? How can this benefit Amazon? And I wanted to actually also think a little bit along the lines of the core business of Amazon, how that could help us. So what I came up with was essentially an IoT device where you can reorder things, or that you could talk to or show something. So the idea is that you could just like take a picture or something, or scan a barcode or something and reorder. So if you run out of milk, you can, or you run out of batteries, you can just sort of scan that and it would know, and it could reorder that like that for you instantly. And so what I did is I set about prototyping this in various ways. And then at the same time, I also had to start looking in the organization, because I didn't have very strong connections to corporate up in Seattle. So I on some other trips to Seattle, when I was up there for other reasons, I would make an effort to sort of reach out to people. I would talk to people down in Lab 126, ask who in Seattle would potentially be interested. And through that, I essentially networked and made connections and found that people were interested. And then all of a sudden, I found that there was a very strong interest from a group called Amazon Fresh that was creating grocery. They were creating a same-day grocery service. And the reorder appliance, the Dash, wasn't called Dash yet, but essentially the thing I was prototyping, was very interesting to them, because they had and apparently they'd even like inquired a couple of years back about having something along these lines, and people told them, oh yeah, it would cost like $100 or more, right? Which may have been true even a few years back, but with all the much cheaper chips available in this space, and much more power efficient chips in this space, and working with real-time operating systems, I knew that they could be done much more efficiently, potentially to the point where it would actually be possible for this to be a service for grocery users. So anyways, long story short, I did a series of presentations and prototypes. I took the feedback from the fresh people and I found out what it was specifically they were looking for. And we ended up releasing Amazon Dash.
By the way,
Mhm.
I feel like there's something you've left out from the story that
Okay.
before
That's quite very
that's
possible.
quite important.
Mhm.
Which is like, look, a lot of people think about innovation as like, if I build a better mousetrap, everyone will want it. And one of the things you told me that was always emphasized within Amazon was that it's not sufficient to build a better mousetrap. It needs to be like 10x better. So like, I remember you specifically telling me that like
Mhm.
one of the things you had to show to the people loosely speaking in HQ was that the normal way that someone would do it, if it takes 1 minute, you need to show that you can do it in 10 seconds or like in 6 seconds, right? 1/10 the amount of time.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of we were doing a lot of comparisons to how long does it take to do this on your phone, as opposed to, because we had to justify it. We also had to answer the question, why shouldn't this just be an app, right? Which is actually, that's the question a lot of hardware companies come across, is why shouldn't this just be an app? So we had to demonstrate like the speed of this. So what it came down to is with the Dash, you could basically take this, you go beep and it's done. So that was the idea. So sometimes we were throwing around the idea like, oh, it's like one click for the physical world, right? Because Amazon's big thing was one click purchases. So yeah, that was definitely something we were looking at. Yeah, so I can give you sort of my spiel on innovation, my theory of it if you want.
Sure.
So for me, like figuring out like when innovation happens is basically an innovation is it's a new idea, right? It's something new out there in the world. And these new ideas, they can only really be based on existing ideas and having a certain combinations of existing ideas, right? For me, it was knowledge of the demand in at Amazon Fresh, the demand for quickly reordering things, and also knowledge of these IoT devices and the knowledge that they were much cheaper than before and more power effective, and that we could make very small, cheap devices. So by combining those two ideas, I was able to come across this new
But
concept.
by the way,
right?
maybe can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Because the ordering that you just gave was unexpected to me.
Okay.
Because I would have said the second thing first, right? Your knowledge of being able to build this cheaply, and then your knowledge of like the Amazon Fresh thing. I would have listed that second, because the way you told the story earlier, it sure sounded to me like the way you figured out the second thing was by networking within Amazon. So that wasn't your first insight. Your first insight was the second thing you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I guess I had a general understanding of what Amazon wanted, and then I was able to find out more specific through the networking. Yes.
Yeah. Well, but I think that's important to note, right?
Yeah.
Because in some sense, like the way these combinations happen is they don't both magically fall from the sky at the same point in time. Is usually one you observe first, and then you need to start opportunistically searching for the second where the combination makes sense.
Yeah, and often it's not two, often it's three or four or five, right?
Yeah, that's right. Right.
But I think, but what's also important is that having these different combinations of ideas as a basis, right? It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So if someone else had these ideas, they wouldn't necessarily have come to the same conclusion. So, and I'm sure I've had combinations of ideas and nothing came of it, and someone else went and like,
you do remember Wedditor, right? That was
and also my campus mail. Yeah, I had a startup called My Campus Mail back at college that I did with a couple of friends, and we were basically providing a webmail interface for students at schools, because believe it or not, a lot of schools did not have a good webmail interface back then, so they had
yours was good
and stuff. Yeah, so we made one, and we let people just type in their college email addresses and passwords, and it would automatically get their email and stuff. Now, if only we had added a social networking feature.
If only, if only.
If only.
That was the
Only.
third thing. You
Sadly,
were a third
yeah,
thing away
sadly, that we're just
from
one step
being the
ahead
most
enough.
hated person in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But anyways, so yeah, but just because you have the prerequisite ideas doesn't mean you're going to have the innovation. But if those prerequisite ideas in a certain combination exist among 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people, if they exist among a certain number of people for a certain amount of time, someone's going to come up with the innovation. That's why if you look in like scientific history, you'll find like people like inventing things like, I think like heavier than air flight, right? It happened, you know, famously with the Wright brothers, but then also some guy in France, like just about the same time. And I think, was it calculus that was independently invented by two people? Yes, yeah. You should know more about this. But the reason that you get these inventions happening within like, you know, literally months of each other in completely different parts of the world, is that those prerequisite ideas, like those combinations of ideas got out there, they got to enough people, and then stochastically, like one or two people out of hundreds or thousands came up with this innovation. So the key thing is the innovation cannot happen without the prerequisite ideas, but it takes a certain amount of time and number of people to have one who is going to actually, you know, make something of that. So I think one way to look at it is it's important, you're asking about like the specific things and the approach. It's important, I think, to have like a deep knowledge of something, but then also to have a broad knowledge of something, right?
That's right. That's right.
Because if you just have really, really deep knowledge in your subject, you're not going to get enough combinations of ideas. You're just going to know like very deeply in one field. If you have very shallow knowledge of lots of things, then what's going to happen is that other people will also have those combinations of ideas, and they're more likely, they're going to get there before you probably, so you'll be late to the party. But if you really have a deep knowledge of something and then you can combine it with a broad knowledge, I think that puts you in the zone where you're more likely to come across an innovation that someone else has not gotten to yet.
By the way, I'll mention one thing. If anyone in this audience is interested in, for instance, scholarship around the process of creativity, a little bit along the lines of what Julien has just said, there's actually a nice book written by a psychologist / education professor at the University of North Carolina. His name is Keith Sawyer, and he has I think his book is called Zigzag. It's not an academic book, it's a popular audience book, where he talks about his research on creativity. And actually, Julien, he says exactly the same thing as you, is that like the most—
good, because I just made it up, so.
Well, I'm sorry to say
that was my
no, but this just illustrates stochasticness. Yeah. Someone else got it.
Exactly. Same thing came up.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's the main thing with innovation. I think another thing with sometimes people ask about sort of like targeted innovation, like how can I innovate for this, or how can I innovate, and that can be tricky because often like innovations are kind of random and they come out of the blue, and then you have to figure out what to do with them, which is sort of what happened with Touchco. But if you are trying to target it, you have to remember that it is stochastic, which means you have to have a lot of people or a lot of iterations or a lot of you have to have a lot of ideas. So having a diverse team is really important, right? People with different backgrounds and different knowledge sets, and actually have them communicating with each other and sharing, you know, so people are not, you know, if everyone's like super siloed, it's not a very innovation friendly space, right? But if your software engineer is talking to your mechanical engineer and talking about their problems, and the mechanical engineer is talking about their problems to the ID people, and, you know, that's a much better, especially, you know, I mean, maybe it's hard to explain the really technical things, but like telling about the challenges you face, that's really, really important, because sometimes someone from a different discipline will find a way of approaching that maybe you wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, if knowledge of the problem and knowledge of the solution reside in the same person, the likelihood that it wouldn't have been solved before is rather low. So the way you solve a well-defined and well-understood problem is by looking for solutions where the people who know the problem don't know the solution.
Yeah.
It's like the only way that it
absolutely.
makes sense.
But it is interesting. Like a big part of not innovating is not knowing the problem. Like a lot of people are very knowledgeable. They're very knowledgeable about a field or about a solution, but they don't know about the problem that this could solve, right?
By the way, I mean,
Mhm.
this is something that's interesting to note, right? Because like there are some people that are extremely gifted at being very self-aware of problems. Most people are not, right?
Mhm.
So if you find people in your network that are really good at that, those are people to keep close to you because
Yeah.
they are
No,
insanely
absolutely.
useful for figuring out the
Honestly,
right
it's
market.
hard.
It's crazy.
It's hard to know what the problems are for a business if you're not intimately working at it. You know, if it's very hard to know what the real day-to-day challenges are.
But there, what I guess my point was slightly different. There are plenty of people that are in there, are exposed to the day-to-day problem and just kind of accept it as a given, as opposed to being like divine discontent. I see this problem and I need to fix it, right? They just
Yeah.
kind of accept it and they roll with it because other people have rolled with it, right?
Yeah.
So it's the ones that really are mindful about it and start saying like, well, how can this be done better? Like those people are pretty
Mhm.
special. I mean,
Yeah.
everyone is special, you know.
Yeah,
Ask your mommy
no,
and daddy, but yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. All right. So
So
what
we'll
else do
talk
we want
about
to cover?
rapid prototyping. Let's
Rapid
tell us
prototyping.
a bit
Okay,
about
let's talk
that, and then
about
we'll open
let's
up.
talk about rapid prototyping.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, so one of the things I did a lot of, well, I both at Touchco and then later at Lab 126, Amazon Lab 126, is rapid prototyping. And so what is rapid prototyping? What is it compared to, I guess, normal prototyping? Rapid prototyping it's a philosophy where you want to build things like quickly and iterate many times. So you want to quickly get something going, learn what you can from it, uh, throw it out, do something else, update, keep cycling. Um, and the reason for this has to do a lot with, like I was saying, like with the stochastic nature of innovation, in that you have to, you often don't know what the problems are until you actually build something. And by building something many times, you are able to get at more problems and you're going to be able to figure things out faster. Um, so key things in rapid prototyping. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what is the goal for the rapid prototyping? And there's it's sort of like a quadrant, if you, I don't know if you want to draw this or something, but basically one thing you're doing is, you don't have to draw it, but in your head, draw it in your head. Basically you have testing functionality. So you're asking yourself, does this work? I have a new idea for a technology. Like, is this worth pursuing? So how can I quickly and cheaply put together something to see if it works? Then there's testing usability, or like how intuitive or compelling an experience is. So maybe you're going to do a mock-up of an app to see how interesting this experience is, or a mock-up of a game, right? Without all the fancy graphics. And then another set of things is you have, maybe you're demonstrating functionality. So you kind of have an idea something works, or you know it works, but it's really rough, and you actually have to show this to the world in a way that's going to be acceptable to them. And then the last quadrant is demonstrating the usability of something. So actually showing someone. And depending on which of these goals you have, you would approach things a little bit differently. The next thing you want to ask is, who are you prototyping for? So are you prototyping for yourself, for your peers in your organization? Are you prototyping for like the general population, for users to like see how well it works with them? Are you prototyping for your bosses or for management to actually get something greenlit in your organization? Or are you prototyping for a client? And each of these has sort of slightly different aspects to it. So last question to ask yourself is, I mean, this is going to sound kind of lazy, but you want to ask yourself, what's the minimum amount of work I can do to achieve this goal for this person, for this target audience? And the main reason, well, there's two big reasons to do this. One is, if you don't think that doing a certain thing will achieve your goal for your target, then you should not do it. It's just a complete waste of time. The other reason you want to do things with the minimum amount of work is that you want to iterate as many times as possible. Often you'll have, like, if you have 6 months to do something, If you do 6 1-month prototypes really cheap and fast, I guarantee you're going to get a better result than if you do 1 6-month prototype, right? Using tons and tons of resources. Okay, should we move to questions? I see some hands going up.
Absolutely. So maybe Alexa can ask first and Saeed second.
Mhm.
Hi, Julian. Thanks for taking the time today.
Hi, Alexa.
Goes back a little bit to kind of an earlier topic when you were talking about your startup and when it got acquired. And you said it was only after 9 months, and you guys, it was either take on some outside investing or go through with the acquisition. And
Yeah.
what was behind, like, what went into that decision, the thought process behind it, and kind of looking back, are you happy with that decision? Do you maybe wish you stayed independent for a little bit longer?
Yeah, no, I'm happy with it. Okay, first of all, I think it was a little bit more, it was 9 months from when the company was founded, but we were actually working on it for a while before the official paperwork went through. You know, we were young, none of us had particularly much money or anything, right? And we had just, spent the last, year or two without a salary. So, when there's an offer on the table, and it's not sort of like selling Snapchat money, but it's it's a big difference when you're a young person working, right? And then in terms of the funding, that's a way we could go. But remember, this was a new technology where we had not really yet demonstrated that someone wanted to buy that. We had not demonstrated that customers wanted to use it. We had not, we were looking for our killer app, and we were exploring a lot of promising things, but there was still a lot of uncertainty around there at the time, and there was competing technologies and there were other things. So there was a substantial element of risk in that. And so, if we were, older and all like, multimillionaires, and like, maybe we made a different decision, say, oh yeah, let's just keep doing this, and we really want to pursue it and get this product on our own. And that would have been a valid decision in that situation. But in our situation, I think what we did made sense. Yeah. And then, also we were going to work for Amazon in this sort of innovation group. It wasn't like a terrible outcome in that aspect either, and I was able to learn and develop, my career a lot there as well.
No, of course. Thanks for the extra detail on that.
Of course.
So you go ahead.
Awesome. So thanks, Julian, for taking the time out to speak with us today. My question is more focused on, you mentioned that you kind of need a depth and a breadth of knowledge and expertise kind of to for a startup to do well. But when you founded your first startup right back in college, I'm curious to know, how did that process look like? Because I'm pretty sure at that point, it was kind of a new experience for you and your co-founders. So how is that process like? And what are some of the things that you learned throughout that process that you wish you kind of knew when you started off?
So, it's like we were doing this while we were in college, we were in different schools, and it wasn't like a hardcore all-in startup situation. It was something sort of like a project.
You did that with Ben Zotto, right?
Yes. Yeah. And Pablo.
Well, why did you tell them what Ben ended up doing?
What? I'll leave that for him.
No.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was sort of like a fun project we were doing in college. And we didn't, honestly, we were all like active undergrads. We didn't really, we didn't put enough time into it effectively. Because we didn't really have enough time, and we were at different places, different schools. So I think it was interesting, and trying to we basically actually ended up a client that we sort of independently invented Ajax for that, which is the asynchronously loading data before that was a real thing on the web, which was fun. So we actually stumbled across some technologies that would actually later be widely used, but long story short, we just didn't put enough time into it, and we were all busy in our studies and doing other things. Yeah.
Busy in the studies, but at the same time, you did take the time to actually, even though you didn't build something commercial from it, You did actually do
no, we got something working.
But also you learned through the process, which is also quite important. Knock.
Sorry, I was on mute. So my question is about your current startup. Like from your experience, do you think that we should go with our idea and then we find the people who can build that idea with us, or we should look at our network and like find like the trend of people around us and then like find something that we can do together? So there are two different ways. Which one do you think that is more useful from this?
I mean, I don't have a clear answer to that. It kind of depends. If you have a brilliant breakthrough idea that you think is going to change the world, then absolutely do that and find the people to do it. If you don't have an idea like that, I mean, find someone who does. Really, it's, you can. It helps to have some really good thing, and remember that it could change. What you end up ultimately doing could change a lot over time. So some things bounce around, like I said before. But yeah, I mean, if you're just a group of people, if people you work really well with, you get along well with, professionally, and that you can work together and you can put up with each other for, days on end, locked in a cage, then I think it's valid to brainstorm and figure out like what you can do and really, but then, really put a lot of time together and think about what you think is something that you're excited about and that would be commercially viable. Yeah, I mean, that is an approach to doing it. Yeah.
I see.
So both are okay. Both are okay.
By the way, I'll mention, kind of chime in with one little thing. Like the type of question that Knock asked, usually in the realm of startups and in the realm of innovation, answers are sufficiently nuanced that there isn't a one size fits all answer to the question you asked. So I actually generally think the more interesting thing that stays constant from case to case, it's more the question as opposed to the answer. And in fact, if you take a look at a lot of VCs, right, the VCs that serve as very good advisors to startups, or not even just investors, right, like good advisors, full stop. When you ask them what do they do and how do they help the startup founders, what most of the time they'll say is their role is not to provide answers. It's to provide the right questions. And so they ask the question to these young, inexperienced founders because those founders don't know the right questions to ask. But then from there, they let the founders come up with the answer because the founders know the nuance oftentimes more so than the advisor does. And because if it was a one size fits all answer, the advisor would just give the answer, right? But they don't do that because it's far more nuanced than that. So anyway, I thought I would chime in with that in light of the style of the question. And it's consistent with your answer, Julian. I guess Tishia next.
Hi, Julien. Thank you for meeting us today.
Hi, Toucho.
I actually have a few questions about the rapid prototyping that you talked about. I want to know, like, if you are going through so many iterations of different products, do you have like an idea bank of all these ideas that you use, and how do you prioritize, and who all contribute to that idea bank?
Yeah, so you prioritize by figuring out what's really crucial to, like, you figure out what's the question you're trying to answer. If the question you're trying to answer is, does this work? You basically want to build something to make it work in miniature, right? If the question you're trying to answer is, demonstrating to your boss that this is viable, then the question you have to ask is, will this prototype convince a boss? I mean, like, with the specific knowledge of that boss and their specific interest in their, right? If the question you're trying to ask is, will this show a compelling use case to a client, then that's what you have to, so you have to ask yourself, let's say, like, okay, if I prototyped this, if I made this prototype, would it answer that, right? Yes or no? The answer is no, don't do it, right? If the answer is yes, then you say, well, okay, could I make a smaller, cheaper prototype that would demonstrate the same thing? And if the answer is yes, then do that instead, right? So I think that is how you go about it. Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, and I also wanted to know, like, who all contributed to these idea banks, like all these
Oh,
different prototypes that you could
Yeah.
build?
Right. Okay. So, well, I mean, as many people as you want. It's good to get ideas, like to gather ideas widely, and then you sort of cull them and sort them out, right? It never hurts to have more ideas and have more opinions on that, you know. And if someone gives you a really bad idea, say, "Oh, yeah, that's interesting, thank you," and then you don't do it.
Wait, that's
But,
how you
but it
always
doesn't
talk
hurt.
to me.
That's how I talk to you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a great idea, Giro. I like that. I like that.
I know.
Good. Okay. So, yeah. So you could definitely do it. But the other thing to keep in mind is it's not like you don't list out a set of ideas, Tisha, and then just go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because often, like, you say, okay, here's my ideas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You do idea 1, and then you're like, oh, ideas 2, 3, and 4 are completely irrelevant now based on the answer from 1. So I'm going to go right to 5. Also, it raised this other question because, like, if it goes over this temperature and then this thing melts, right? So we have to answer question 6 about what material can we use for that, right? So often the ideas are they're very dynamic and they change with every iteration, which is yet another reason you want to have many iterations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Matt?
Hi, thanks for taking the time. I have a question sort of on like the strategy side of building your product, well, more like the environment, and just really like when Amazon was knocking on your door, like take away like the risk aspect. I know it's a very important part, but from like where you see the product going, was that either a sense of fear because they could come in and like sort of take away your product or like make their own, or 2, were you like, when you think that you could have been acquired, was that like a source of potential excitement that you thought it could like fund your research, fund your growth, scale, or and how did you see integrating with Amazon like affecting the trajectory or path that you wanted to take your product down?
Yeah, so Amazon had a specific use that they were looking at. So they were not interested in all of the things that we were exploring with our product. So they had a specific use that they wanted to do with it, which I can't get into it too much. But so, you know, we basically would go. We're able to, you know, we once after an acquisition, you have a comparatively huge amount of funding to actually go and really develop that aspect of the technology or that application of the technology, whereas you do have to sort of let go of some like dreams and ideas you had about other applications of the technology, which can be difficult. It can be very stressful for founders who, you know, where the technology is your baby.
Yeah, and so like following on from that, do you think like I suppose like I know you said you can't go into too much detail on it, but would those alternative like uses been like competing offerings, or like how did it constrict it in the sense that were they just focused on, they just wanted a certain service or product that they wanted to do, and I'm just curious.
They wanted a certain aspect, a certain application of the technology.
I mean, we can take an example, for instance, right? Like Julien talked about going to the New Orleans Design Conference, right? You know, like think of it like another product that might be of interest to a designer, like a Wacom tablet, right? Like one could imagine that technology could have been acquired by a Wacom.
Yeah, no, there are definitely other companies who potentially could acquire, yeah.
But like Amazon was like, no, Kindle, right? Loosely speaking, right? So yeah, you're giving up some. These are very interesting trade-offs that people need to think about when it's a trade-off between, you know.
And you know, honestly, it can be hard to make rational decisions when you're emotionally involved with your product, you know, especially for the inventor of a product, right? Yeah. It could be, you know, it could be difficult, but it's, you know, it's something where you have to sort of weigh the, you know, the interests and the benefits on both sides. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting.
And the risks. Yeah.
Brian?
Hey, Brian, you're on mute.
No, Brian, I think is having Wi-Fi issues. He just,
okay.
Do you see the question? I'll read it.
Oh, hey, no, I did. Hold on, let me see.
I'll read it so that someone.
Yeah, so read it so that people
recording,
can hear it.
yeah. Hey, Julien, thank you for joining us today. Okay, well, I can skip that part. Do you reflect on successes and failures throughout your career? And if so, how and how often? As in, what's your process of looking back on different experiences and isolating what went well, what didn't, and key takeaways?
It's interesting. Well, they say, you know, the joke is that experience is something that you gain right after you need it, right? So, yeah, it's I don't know, in terms of when, let me think about that. I mean, often you think about those things. I think when you're thinking of making changes, or when you're thinking of going to a new role or a new company, I think that's when there's sort of inflection points in your life and you're going in a different direction. I think a lot of those questions come up, and you think on about like good decisions or bad decisions. But I mean, I don't do it sort of like every day. I think that would sort of wear you down after a while. But yeah.
But one thing that's for sure is that there will be a lot of successes, but also a lot of failures for pretty much everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I will say,
especially in startups, I mean, there's guaranteed to be, if you're not having any failures, you're doing something wrong, which is a failure, I guess. But yeah, so if you're not having any failures, you're probably not looking, because like no one does everything right immediately off the bat, right? And usually you end up doing something quite different than what you imagined early on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's part of the fun of it all, actually.
It is.
I want to ask a couple of maybe final questions maybe before we wrap up. Again, we really, really appreciate you taking the time to spend part of your Thanksgiving weekend with us. American Thanksgiving, the one that people tend to take more serious. I guess maybe I shouldn't say that, but in any case, you know, maybe you could reflect a little bit on kind of your style of operating while we were both in college, right? Maybe some of the unique features of that, and maybe telling us maybe how that style or that set of experiences there might have been helpful to you, both in your time in Touchco and your time at Amazon Lab 126.
Yeah, so my style, I don't know. So I mean, I'm probably not as organized as Dr. Kondo here.
Oh my God.
Is that an understatement?
You are extremely unorganized.
Not true, but anyway. Yeah, I mean, so I think that, like, my strength, I often would leave things more towards the last minute, but I just about always got things done, and I sort of was able to kick things into high gear when needed, yeah. So as Jiro can attest, it'd be up till 4 a.m, but I think being able to sort of kick in when you need to, though, it's a good aspect. It's a good thing to have. And part of it is being flexible and being able to do what's needed when it's needed is an important thing.
Yeah, I mean,
but that said, I think it's actually good to have a mix of people. I don't think you want to have an entire team like that. I think you also need to have people who are very persistent and and very consistent with it as well. I think part of that is having a diversity on your team and having different work styles, and like all of those are valid and have different values. But
yeah, I mean, I would say, like, some of the aspects of your style, I mean, it taught you to prioritize well on the fly, right? Because you don't have the luxury to waste your time on something that won't move the needle, and to basically get things done with limited resources. So, I mean, I can see both of those things being very helpful in at both Amazon and Touchco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
By the way, just in terms of like Julien doing things at the last second, let me give you a little personal anecdote here. Julien was the best man at my wedding. And I still remember, first of all, he gave the best man speech. And I don't even think it's me being biased, by the way, like the best one that I've ever heard at all the weddings that I've been to. it was also written on his electricity bill, because he wrote the whole speech like while in the car driving up from New York to Boston. So he was always good about doing something that actually looks remarkably good to like an audience or to a customer and stuff like that, but having to do it on the fly. And maybe one of the things that made your speech, and by the way, there are other people that were at the wedding that said the same thing, is by having to kind of focus on the things that matter most, you actually had a very creative, but also kind of simple and not over complexified speech. It kind of hit on the essence of me and of my wife at the time.
I mean, constraints are actually one of the things that drive innovation. Sometimes some people think, oh, constraints are bad and that they have to have. Often when you have certain constraints on yourself, like when cell phones first came out and you had these little tiny screens and we had to figure out how do we interact with these little tiny screens. Having constraints is a huge driver of creativity. And I've done like seminars and things like that where they'll actually go and they'll intentionally put artificial constraints on you. And this is one of the things at Amazon with Dash is we had this constraint of having to be sort of like a little tiny battery powered thing. So, you couldn't have a big, huge, expensive processor, and we had to figure out how to do things with that. So yeah, so if you do have constraints in your life, and that includes constraints on time and constraints on the technologies you have access to, embrace it and figure out how you can actually use that to your advantage. It's like innovation judo.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually maybe a good way to finish this event, right? Maybe some food for thought for all of the students here. There are two things that I think maybe would be interesting for you guys to reflect on. One is what Julien just said, is like, are there situations for you where putting constraints on what you allow yourself to do versus not might bring something special out of you that wouldn't have come out any other way? Interesting. I don't have an answer there, by the way. It's just a question.
Yeah, it's a fun exercise.
It's a fun exercise. Another fun exercise is, think about all the rapid prototyping stuff that Julien mentioned. And by the way, this video will be posted at some point. So if you don't remember any of it, I'll send out a link eventually and I'll timestamp it so you can go right to that spot if you ever want to remember what Julien mentioned. But maybe ask yourself, like, how could you take some of the ethos and mindset of rapid prototyping to make yourself more productive, more innovative, so that you can put yourself in a better position in your career to find a way to make yourself, find a way to define what you do in a novel way and that better leverages your strengths. And I think if you do that successfully, you will be both happier and more successful. So it might be, I think it would be fun to think through. So yeah, I guess maybe we can leave it at that, unless you have some final.
Thank you very much for having me, Jero. It was great chatting, and it's nice being great questions from everyone. If you have any other questions for me, feel free to DM me on LinkedIn or Twitter. It's just at Julien Beguin. And look forward to seeing what all of you guys are going to do.
Thank you so much, Julien.
Thank you, Joe.